Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Mark Madness. Before we dive into the Gospel of Mark, I actually want you to go to a different book of the Bible. Specifically, I want you to go to Isaiah chapter 35, verses 1 through 6. Read those verses before you dive into Mark chapter 7. These verses are important because what the prophets often do is the prophets are proclaiming the coming work of God. And it's the day of the Lord is the phrase that is often used. And the day of the Lord is both a day of judgment for anybody who would resist God and deny him, but it's also a blessing for those who are repentant and have faith in God. And so the prophets are declaring this coming day of the Lord where God is going to enter history and work in powerful ways. Now, the way the prophets work is they can often talk about two things at once. So when they talk about the day of the Lord, they are often thinking about the final day of the Lord, where God is going to bring a final judgment and a final blessing. But in between now and that final day, there may be other days of the Lord that foreshadow the final day, that you might even say are foretastes of the coming day. So let me give you an example. The prophets often talk about the exile into Babylon, where Babylon comes into Judah and takes away its people. Remember Daniel and his three friends, and they're taken away because Judah's being punished for their idolatry and their sin against God. And so that is a day of the Lord. It's not the ultimate day of the Lord, but it's a foreshadowing, a foretaste of what is coming. In Isaiah chapter 35, verses 1 through 6, we're going to see that again. And the terms, the description that Isaiah uses is God coming in with this ministry of restoration and reconciliation, and the deaf can hear. Well, what happens in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 to 37, is Jesus heals a deaf person. Jesus is leaving Tyre, where he had the meeting with the Syrophoenician woman. And so he's still in the area of the Decapolis. He's still in a Gentile area, and people are still coming to him to be healed. That seems to happen everywhere he goes. And Jesus heals this Gentile. He restores hearing to his deaf ears. Even though Mark doesn't quote Isaiah chapter 35, what we're seeing is that Jesus is fulfilling Isaiah chapter 35. Because even though the ultimate day of the Lord is not present in Jesus' first coming, Jesus' first coming provides a foretaste of what's to come. Just like he raises Lazarus from the dead, even though Lazarus is going to experience death again, Lazarus being raised from the dead is a foretaste of the coming resurrection. It's a mighty work of God here and now that foreshadows, that previews the ultimate work of God. And that's what's going on here. Jesus is again proving himself to be the Messiah, proving himself to have authority, proving to have God's authority because he is God. And so Mark 7, in a very strong way, is this foretaste of the coming day. And what it proves is that Jesus is the promised Messiah. Jesus is the one who will bring about that final blessing and that final judgment. And we're seeing evidences of it here and now. So even though this passage doesn't state, I quote Isaiah explicitly, it does so implicitly by showing that Jesus is doing God's works and Jesus has God's authority. It's interesting in this passage, again, we come back to that messianic secret. You remember in the Gospel of Mark, every once in a while, Jesus does something and the people don't listen. When he says, don't tell anybody. Jesus does something and he says, don't tell anybody about this because he wants to prevent these misunderstandings of the type of Messiah he is. But of course, they never listen. And that's exactly what happens in this passage. Jesus says, hey, don't tell anyone about this. But they keep telling people about it. and more people come. So that's the end of Mark chapter 7. It's a small story about Jesus healing, but again, I want you to see the greater significance that this is revealing that Jesus is acting on behalf of God, that he is God's Messiah, because he is doing these things that give a foretaste of God's coming kingdom. The kingdom begins with Jesus, and it finds its ultimate fulfillment when Jesus returns. So we're just getting glimpses of what that final kingdom will look like.